Ocarina of Time is a game that needs no introduction. It's extremely critically acclaimed, being the highest rated game of all time on Metacritic. Ocarina is one of the most influential games ever. With the move to 3D, you might expect a huge departure from the previous games, but the game remains faithful to the core Zelda mechanics and themes. Before I get into the video, I do have to warn that there will be spoilers for Ocarina of Time and previous games in the series, especially A Link to the Past. If you haven't played these games and want to go into them blind, you may wish to avoid this video. With that in mind, it's time to get started with the Evolution of Zelda, the Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time released in 1998 with a huge $12 million budget. It's hard to find exact numbers, but from what I can find, it seems like where other Zelda games had relatively few people work on them, Ocarina of Time may have had up to 120 developers. I don't want to delve too deeply into the development of the game, but it's safe to say that the team were given the resources they needed to make something entirely new. The game pushed the boundaries not just of the Zelda franchise, but of gaming as a whole. Not only did they achieve this, they did it while maintaining the feel of a Zelda game. Before Breath of the Wild came along, if someone had only played a single Zelda game, it was almost always Ocarina of Time. The influence of this game is hard to overstate. Ocarina was a huge shift for the Zelda series, and on the surface, it seems wildly different from the previous games. If you look a little deeper, there are more similarities than you might expect. Ocarina borrows heavily from the older games, especially A Link to the Past. When it's not taking elements directly, it's often referencing or making callbacks to the 2D games. That said, I don't want to downplay the jump to 3D. There are plenty of aspects of Ocarina which are completely new and diverge from the older games. The new perspective inherently forces many changes. One of the most obvious places to see this is in the visuals. Early 3D visuals can sometimes be difficult to stomach. In general, I find that the pixel art visuals of many 2D games have aged better than their early 3D counterparts. Ocarina is not immune to this. Its visuals can often look rough by today's standards, with low detail and low resolution textures. Perhaps the worst offender are house interiors, which are often just a flat 2D background which Link walks in front of. It's worth noting that on the much lower definition CRT screens of the time, these imperfections would have been less noticeable. If you can get over the low fidelity, there are some positive notes. As with the previous games, the art direction is masterful. Every area is distinct and stylized in a way which gives it character while still fitting in with the larger world. Through areas like the Temple of Time, the Shadow Temple, and the Market Town, the game creates a strong sense of atmosphere. Despite the dated visuals, the game is still able to instill wonder, unease, and a variety of other feelings throughout its playtime. There is a 3DS remake which alleviates some of the age-related issues, although no remake for home consoles yet. Alternatively, there is a 4K texture pack available on emulators, although I haven't tried it so I can't vouch for how closely it sticks to the original art style. Ocarina isn't a bad looking game for its time, but it can be hard to look past its age at points. This game is crying out for a true HD remaster. One area of Ocarina's presentation that has not aged is the music. Koji Kondo outdid himself with this soundtrack. The music is higher fidelity, opting for instruments over chiptunes. There's also a lot more music this time around, with almost every area having its own theme. The music and soundscape are part of what makes the atmosphere in this game so strong despite its age. The songs in Ocarina do a good job of setting the tone for the different areas. The title theme is quiet and somber, a departure from the more heroic and upbeat themes of the previous games. It conveys that this game is going to be darker and more serious. This contrasts with some of the more upbeat themes, like the shop theme or the Lost Woods, one of the catchiest game themes ever. Many of the themes set a strong tone, but I have to give a special mention to the Temple of Time. The moment I first walked into the Temple of Time was the moment I was sold on the game. Although most of the music is tied to an area, there are some character themes. Most notably, the theme of Sheik is calm and reassuring, while holding a little secret that hints at things to come. There are relatively few character themes in this game, with most of them being reserved either for bosses or important characters like Sheik or Zelda. It's clear that the world of Hyrule is being given huge importance in this game. The world is structured differently from the previous games. Where in those games every area flowed into the next, the Hyrule of Ocarina has a central hub. Almost every area branches off from Hyrule Field, and while there are other paths around, it's the clear centre of the world. Like the previous games, the world is open, and there are many areas you can visit earlier than required. Despite this, the game is linear. Most dungeons require items from previous dungeons to enter, making their order fairly set. There are times you can sequence break, but there's a clear intended order, and you have to go out of your way to deviate. Navi also repeatedly prompts you to go to the next area. The only Zelda game that truly let you do dungeons in whatever order you wanted was Zelda 1, so this linearity isn't surprising. That's not to say there isn't a lot of side content in this game. The world features several towns and villages, all of which are more fleshed out than the towns in the previous games. Although by today's standards the world is small, each area is distinct. No two areas feel the same. Traversing the world starts difficult, but quickly becomes easier as you gain access to a horse as well as several songs to warp around. Many areas are inspired by or named after areas from previous games. This has been a trend for all the games up to this point and continues here. In particular, there are a lot of areas that come from A Link to the Past. These include Hyrule Castle, Kakariko Village, the Lost Woods, Death Mountain, Zora's Waterfall, and Lake Hylia. Most of these areas bear only superficial similarities to the original areas. A new addition is the day-night cycle. Time progresses automatically, but you can also skip to dawn or dusk using a special song. While there are a few events that require a specific time, overall the day-night cycle isn't used that much. Notably, golden sculptures, a new collectible type, can only be found at night. This concept of time always advancing will come back and be more fleshed out in the next game. The next few parts of the video will contain spoilers for both A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. If you want to avoid these spoilers, skip to the time shown on screen now. Partway through Ocarina, you grab the Master Sword and are sent 7 years forward in time. From this point forwards, there are two variations of the world. The peaceful world you inhabit as a child, and the adult world of the future, corrupted by Ganondorf's rule. It's hard not to think back to A Link to the Past, with its Dark World and Light World, and this mechanic is similar. The Dark World was essentially a twisted evil version of the Light World, following the same overall layout as the Light World, but with each screen being almost entirely different. The differences between the two worlds are smaller in Ocarina. The layouts are mostly the same outside of a few key areas. In both games, the later world serves a dual purpose. Firstly, to give us a glimpse at a hostile reflection of the world, what the world would become if Link were to fail their quest. Secondly, the introduction of a second world as a modified version of the first allows the developers to reuse assets, which is important as space was a valuable commodity for developers. Despite the adult world being less of a full overhaul than the Dark World, I think it's better executed. It demonstrates the tyranny of Ganondorf firsthand and allows you to more directly see the consequences of events that happened in the past. It also allows for some nice puzzles, where doing one thing in the past will change the world in the future. Although limited by the technology of the time, Ocarina gets good mileage out of time travel. Since we're already in spoiler territory, now is probably a good time to talk about story. The story takes a much bigger focus than in any of the previous games. There are more cutscenes and world building, as well as far more dialogue. Major characters get many more lines than before, and side characters often get multiple lines of dialogue, when previously they'd only get one. This all adds up to Ocarina of Time having a far deeper story than any of the previous games, with a far more fleshed out world and characters. I enjoyed the story of this game a lot. It's a standard hero's journey style story, but it has some interesting themes in places. It's the kind of story you could ignore if you wanted to, but you could also spend a lot of time analysing. Despite the game being fairly self-contained, the story is a clear prequel to A Link to the Past. Many events, like the corruption of the Sacred Realm, the Seven Sages, and the Sealing of Ganondorf, are referenced or take place during this game. It's fun to imagine how the areas of this game will change to become what they are in A Link to the Past, even if there are several aspects you have to ignore for it to make sense. I'm aware that there is an official Zelda timeline and that the chronology is far more complicated, but let's not go into that here. The overall tone of Ocarina of Time is darker than the previous games. Sure, outside of Link's Awakening, they've all been games about saving the world, but Ocarina of Time really emphasises just how bad everything will be if you fail. Although the first part isn't too dark, as soon as you go to the future, you see people give in to the worst sides of themselves, or struggle under the oppressive rule of Ganondorf. Towns that were once bustling with life are now empty. Even the title screen is darker, a quiet tune playing as Link rides through an empty Hyrule field. Although previous games did have their dark elements, this game commits much more to the theme. That's not to say that Ocarina of Time is a dark and dismal game. Far from it. For the most part, it's a heroic adventure like the previous games. As you'd expect, it's full of offbeat charm. One of my favourite examples is how the Goron standing near the shortcut to the Lost Woods comments about hearing the music. There's also some funny jokes, like how the magic bean salesman originally complains that they're not popular. As you buy more and more, he suddenly starts boasting about how fast they're selling. This video has been going on for a while, and I've not even talked about anything gameplay related yet. As you might expect, the shift in perspective has resulted in quite a few changes to the gameplay. Like many early 3D games, the camera controls have some problems. It's not too bad here, since many parts of the game use a fixed camera. There are a few times where you do need to manually control the camera, which can be fiddly at times. The combat system in this game is simple. You have an attack button that performs a chain of attacks. You can also block and dodge in several directions. As you'd expect, you have a few extra options, like the spin attack, jump attack, and some items. You generally lock onto an enemy and fight them one by one. This can make fighting multiple enemies difficult, but the encounters are well designed to prevent this from happening in ways that feel cheap. Although it took me a bit of getting used to, the combat in this game is not as difficult as many of the previous games. It's more on par with the difficulty of Link's Awakening than the first 3 games. I never felt the need to be cautious about taking damage. The combat is hard enough to be engaging, but not hard enough that you're likely to die often. This is probably a good balance. The game plays to its strengths. If it was filled with combat gauntlets, it would become a chore. For the most part, Ocarina controls fine. It's not as tight as modern games, but for an early 3D game, it's well executed, all things considered. The only thing I would complain about is the aiming of weapons like bows. There's no crosshair, and the aiming controls feel overly sensitive. This made some of the bow sections feel janky. It's hard to say whether or not this is a valid complaint. I played the game on an emulator with an Xbox controller. Perhaps if I was playing on the proper hardware with the controller the game was designed around, I would have had a better experience. Despite the simple combat, there is a good variety of enemies in Ocarina. Like in previous games, some enemies require a unique strategy to defeat, whereas others are a test of mastery. I particularly enjoyed fighting the Iron Knuckles. They're not difficult, but they are satisfying to bring down. Many enemies return from previous games, often staying close to the original concept. Wall Masters return, but they're now easier to dodge and kill, which makes them less annoying. Stalfos, Lizalfos, and a few other enemies test your ability to counterattack a defensive enemy. These feel similar to some of the enemies in Zelda 2, although they're nowhere near as difficult. Gibdos have been completely redesigned and now stun you if they look at you. Redeads are functionally similar to Gibdos, but way more terrifying. The first time I saw them and heard that scream, I jumped. I was not expecting that. The enemies in Ocarina of Time are interesting to fight. Where they fit, enemies from older games are used, but the game isn't afraid to throw in new concepts or to redesign enemies. Similar to other games in the series, the bosses blend puzzles with combat. There are less bosses in this game than previous games, but their scope has been greatly increased. The boss fights have much greater spectacle and now have unique rooms designed around the encounter. When executed well, bosses can be some of the most memorable parts of the game. I particularly liked the Phantom Ganon and Twin Rover boss fights, but most of the fights are enjoyable. The only boss I really disliked was Morpher. The fight didn't pose much challenge and I found it tedious. The concept was okay, but not particularly well executed. The fight doesn't really develop and it went on far too long. Although looking online, it seems like there's an easy quick kill strategy. Most of the bosses fall somewhere in the middle, being interesting in concept but having some flaws. Bongo Bongo, for example, has an awesome design, but sometimes it felt more like I was fighting the camera than the boss. Despite the flaws, it's hard to deny the increased spectacle these fights bring. I'd say the good far outweighs the bad. The game also manages to avoid reusing bosses, which helps to keep things fresh. The move to 3D gives the dungeons in Ocarina a greater scale than before. It feels like a similar leap in complexity to when A Link to the Past added floors. The dungeons are far more varied than before, both visually and in terms of gameplay design. While the dungeons in previous games did have some theming, it doesn't come close to Ocarina. The dungeons scale up in complexity well, so that no dungeon feels overwhelming compared to the last. This complexity reaches its peak with the Water Temple, and later dungeons are simpler in comparison. The Water Temple is infamous, and I imagine if I was a kid it would be easy to get stuck and never finish the game. It's unique in its freeform design, giving you access to most of the rooms from the start and leaving you to figure out the order. In contrast, the rest of the dungeons are mostly linear, featuring only short branching paths. Many puzzles in the Water Temple require visiting specific spots to change the water level. This is one of the only examples of puzzles extending beyond a single room. Finally, the mini-boss of the Water Temple is by far the hardest fight in the game. I can certainly see why the Water Temple has its reputation, but I enjoyed it a lot. The rest of the dungeons in this game never feel overwhelming. They're all well paced, with strong theming and consistently good puzzle design. While the number of dungeons in this game is more comparable with Zelda 1 than it is A Link to the Past, each dungeon is more memorable than any game before. I can recall a few notable dungeons from each of the previous games, but I think it will be a while before I forget any of Ocarina's dungeons. Taking a cue from A Link to the Past, each dungeon has a new item that's required to complete the dungeon. Like in the previous games, the best items are the ones that allow you to interact with the world in new ways. The hookshot returns, and while the range is limited, the third dimension adds an interesting level of verticality. My favourite new addition is the hover boots. They're not as powerful as the name implies, but they're still an awesome addition. Like in Link's Awakening, the Ocarina has multiple songs. Some of these have utility, like changing the time of day, whereas others allow you to warp around the world. This time around, you play a song by inputting a sequence of notes, which is a nice touch. The magic meter returns in this game. It's one of the only concepts introduced in Zelda 2 that has been carried forward throughout the series. There are 3 spells, as well as some elemental arrow types. One spell, Pharaoh's Wind, is notable for letting you create a warp point within a dungeon that you can then teleport to from any other room. It's a cool idea, but most of the dungeons are too linear for it to really be necessary. Also returning are collectibles. Alongside pieces of heart are golden sculptures. These fill a similar role to the seashells in Link's Awakening. The game being 3D gives a much bigger scope for the sculptures to be hidden, although they do have a noticeable audio cue. There are 100 in total, but after 50 there are no rewards until you get all 100, and the last major reward is at 30, a number you'll probably reach without trying too hard. I do prefer the idea of there being multiple rewards. In Link's Awakening, the seashells were pointless unless you got enough for the reward. I do think that 30 being enough to get the biggest reward is probably too few. Towards the end of the game, they don't really feel valuable to hunt down. The pieces of heart work exactly how they did in the previous games. They're a nice reward for going off the beaten track, and the game isn't too difficult that you feel punished if you miss some. There are some other secrets to find, like the fairy fountains, which give you permanent upgrades on new spells. The collectibles and secrets do a good job of getting you to explore the world, serving the same purpose as in the previous games. Ocarina of Time has a healthy amount of side content. There are several minigames, such as bomb tube bowling, fishing, and horseback archery. Whereas in previous games, most of the side content was near enough mandatory, here most of it is optional. For example, Ocarina of Time has 2 separate trading sequences, one for Bigoron's sword, and one for the Mask of Truth. Link's Awakening also had a trading sequence, but in that game it was basically mandatory to complete the game. The rewards for the side content are nice, but none of them feel mandatory. There's even a whole optional challenge dungeon. If you have the Mask of Truth, you can find a secret stone that tells you that the reward of the challenge dungeon isn't that important. Even getting your horse is technically skippable side content. You could easily beat the game without doing any of the side content if you wanted. The side content in Ocarina is well worth doing. Despite being optional, it's still high quality. The only issue I have with the side content is it feels like the game doesn't want you to take breaks from the main story. Not only does the game never truly require you to do the side content, Navi regularly nags you to get on with the main story. The main story plot being so serious also makes it feel a bit inappropriate for Link to be going off bowling. This is a minor complaint though, the side content is worth doing and it's easy to just ignore Navi. Ocarina of Time is a fantastic game. Although it has aged in some places, it's still a masterpiece that holds up to this day. It's clear to see how this game became the blueprint for countless games that followed. Like the previous games, it's immaculately polished and oozes charm. Despite the move to 3D, the game remains faithful to the series and sits at home amongst the other games. I could keep gushing about this game, but you get the picture by now. Like the first game, there's a second story equivalent called Master Quest. I may do a video at some point covering remakes and alternate versions. This series has a lot of them. In the next episode of the Evolution of Zelda, I'll be looking at Majora's Mask, a strange entry in the series, reusing many assets from Ocarina. That video may be a while away, as this video took a lot of time and effort to make. In the meantime, there's a few other games I want to catch up on, especially Bomb Rush Cyberpunk, which will probably need its own video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on the Evolution of Zelda.